Welcome to Israel Explained, where we help you understand Israel, Israel's neighbors, and provide you with context to understand the Middle East. My name's Avery Chenault, and I'm joined by Passage's resident scholar, Josiah McGee. On October 8th, the day after Hamas's invasion of Israel, Hezbollah, located in Lebanon, began firing thousands of rockets, missiles, and drones into Israeli territory. Because of this, thousands of Israeli civilians have been forced to evacuate their home in Israel's north amid escalations. Today, we're talking about who Hezbollah is, explaining the history behind Hezbollah and their undeniable connection to Iran. So, Josiah, can you give us an overview of who exactly Hezbollah is? A brief overview. I know we're going to get into them more in this conversation, but just give us what we need to know moving forward.
Yeah, I would love to. So, very simply, it's a Shia, which will become important in a moment. We'll explain why. It's a Shia group. It's a revolutionary, political, and terror organization founded in Lebanon. It's considered by a good portion of the international community to be a foreign terrorist organization. It's a product in many ways of some extremely complicated Lebanese politics, but also of the politics of Iran and its regional strategy as well. So a lot to unpack there in terms of all the context about where it comes from, who it answers to, what it believes, why. It's going to be a great conversation.
Yes, absolutely. So can you tell us what we need to know about Lebanon's history to really understand Hezbollah?
Sure. So the important thing to understand about Lebanon is that it's a little bit different than some of Israel's other neighbors. And if you want more of the full scope of sort of who are Israel's neighbors and where are they in relation to Israel on the map and all of that, we have a great video on Israel's neighbors. I encourage the audience to go watch that. But when it comes to Lebanon, a bit about the internal politics is important. So Lebanon has a complicated history, if you will. It was sort of founded in part with the support of France, who after World War I was kind of divvying up portions of the Middle East. And it divided Lebanon and Syria. It created Lebanon, presumably, at least in part, so that there would be a country which had at least a significant amount of influence controlled by a Christian population, because there really weren't any other states like that in the Middle East. But it is a state which also has not just Christians, but also other sects as well. So it's a very divided sectarian country in many ways. So you have the Maronite Christians, who are some relation to Maronite Christians in Israel as well. There's usually some ties or familiarity. You also have Sunni Muslims and you have Shia Muslims, and all of them do not necessarily get along. They have unique ideologies, they have unique histories, they have unique political agendas, and it's really a pretty complicated place because of that. And so in large part, Lebanon tried to create some sort of power-sharing model in order to deal with the fact that you have these three competing groups who are all at least a little bit at odds with each other or don't necessarily get along. It didn't work very well. They've tried multiple times to sort of remedy and add some fixes to the system. And frankly, it's a pretty broken political system. It doesn't work very well. There's a reputation for corruption. At this point, especially because of the amount of control that an organization like Hezbollah has in Lebanon, Lebanon itself is viewed as somewhat of a failed state almost. The government, it doesn't really have a lot of control over what's happening. And it's fairly inept because of the sectarian divides, the difficulty overcoming them, the corruption that's involved, and all of these things.
So you've talked a little bit about Shia Islam. So why is it important that we understand this in order to understand Hezbollah?
Yeah, so Shia Islam is very critical to Hezbollah's narrative about how it was founded, what it believes, what its values are, what's important. The legend, if you will, of Shia Islam is core to the story of Hezbollah, but also it's pretty key to understanding some of the political dynamics that are at work. Like I just explained, you've got these three major religious groups in Lebanon sort of vying for some influence and power. Shia Islam is one of two major branches of Islam. It is the much smaller of the two. It was formed as a result of some debate and actually conflict, some violent conflict between different groups or factions of Muslims who were debating the issue of the Prophet Muhammad's succession. There was a pretty significant conflict that occurred that is still memorialized in the Shia holidays that are separate from Sunni holidays, a conflict which was between Sunni and Shia leaders, in which a Shia leader was considered to be martyred by the Sunni caliph or leader. So there's some pretty serious tension between Sunni and Shia Muslims, and there's some ideological differences, obviously some historical differences, disagreements over the historical narrative about how both groups were founded, came to be, and that sort of thing. It does, despite the fact that it's much smaller than Sunni Islam, have a fair amount of adherents in different places like Iraq or Bahrain, Kuwait, Lebanon, Syria, Iran especially. So it does have a fairly sizable presence in the Middle East, probably less so outside the Middle East more than likely. But it's very important to understand the history of that conflict between Sunni and Shia Islam. Shia Islam in many ways is viewed with some suspicion, and even today, not just historically, but even today, is oftentimes persecuted by Sunnis. Actually, Shia militia groups were a key target of ISIS, ISIS being a very extreme Sunni group. One of the things that it did was not just kill non-Muslims, but try to kill a lot of Shia Muslims too. So there's a degree to which the historical experience of Shia Muslims has been experiencing some degree of marginalization or even outright persecution, not just by non-Muslims, but also by Sunni Muslims. And it's because of their religious disagreements, but also because of some perceived, partially based in reality, partially not, links between Shia Islam and Persian imperialism, which has really stirred a lot of tensions in the region between Arabs and Persians or Iran today. And the reality is that Shia Islam predates, obviously, the Persian Caliphate or Muslim Empire, but the link between the two is still problematic, politically speaking, and leads to a lot of the tension between Shia and Sunnis.
Yeah. So looking specifically at Lebanon, what is the Shia experience like in Lebanon?
Not good. Because of the persecution, and also just because of the socioeconomic, political, economic realities of Lebanon, it's been a pretty poor experience overall. They've been, generally speaking, less well off historically. They primarily settled in agricultural areas. A lot of them settled in southern Lebanon, which is where Hezbollah has a large stronghold today, also in the southern suburbs of Beirut. And in many cases, they were experiencing a lot of problems, trouble, not just from the Sunni groups in Lebanon or the Maronite Christian groups, but also from Shia elites.
Yeah.
Many Shia have been, unfortunately, they consider themselves victimized by the corruption of wealthy Shia elites who are taking advantage of the majority of Shia who live in these agricultural communities or in the mountains or something like that. And it's a problem. It's led to a lot of issues. There's also, of course, the perception of neglect by the national government because of the sectarian divides. Maybe they're not getting as many resources as they should, this sort of thing. And it's led to really a core part of the Shia experience in Lebanon being this very real sense of, and very deep-rooted sense of oppression. We've been oppressed. We've been taken advantage of, not just by other groups, but also by our own leaders. And that, especially, the combination of those two things together is part of what creates the sense of revolutionary politics. We have to do what we can to seek liberation, to deal with oppression both from our own leaders and the other leaders of other groups. And historically, they've been actually pretty susceptible to both revolutionary and even socialist politics, the Shia Muslims. It's not necessarily obvious, or wasn't obvious at first, that they would follow an organization like Hezbollah. And even today, not all Shia Muslims in Lebanon support Hezbollah. They still support a variety of other groups, including secular, even socialist groups that they think might be able to help them deal with this history of oppression.
Yeah. So I'm curious, kind of thinking more towards how Lebanon is involved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Do people in Lebanon who identify with Shia Islam, automatically identify with the Palestinian cause?
Yes and no. So to a degree, yes, because many Shia Muslims look at the narrative that Palestinians are telling the world, that they are oppressed, that they are under an occupation, that they need to be liberated, and they resonate with that.
Yeah.
They view that experience as somewhat similar to their own, and they're going to hear that, and they're gonna buy into that fairly quickly in some cases. Yeah. On the flip side, it is not always true that they're going to agree with each other, because they have some very real differences too.
Yeah.
You know, most Palestinians are Sunni. Most Shia Muslims, obviously we're talking Shia Muslims, they're not going to agree ideologically with everything that a Sunni Palestinian Muslim has to say. So there is a bit of a common experience, but not necessarily a shared ideology, which makes the relationship kind of an interesting one. It's a little flexible. It's not necessarily complete loyalty or commitment to the Palestinian cause. And you can see some of that relationship strain actually happened in the last century. You had various cases where Shiites were actually a little bit angry with Palestinians, especially the PLO, because when the PLO and especially let's say the 70s, 80s, that kind of thing, they were operating in southern Lebanon. They were launching attacks against Israel from southern Lebanon. Eventually, Israel invades. Yeah. And a lot of the Shia Muslims in Lebanon at the time looked at that and went, okay, first of all, why are you bringing the fight to us? You know, we support you kind of in your fight against Israel, but we'd really rather you didn't bring the fight here and cause it to impact Lebanese civilians and that we start losing our lives over this issue. So there is a bit of a strain there, a tension sometimes. It's an uneasy relationship to a certain degree.
Yeah, very interesting. So you've already given us a brief overview of who Hezbollah is. Could you give us a little more information on how Hezbollah was founded and why exactly they were founded?
Yeah, well, it had a lot to do with that period that I was just describing, where some of this violence starts to really bubble up in Lebanon. And actually what it winds up happening is that there's a civil war that happens in Lebanon. It starts mid-70s, goes almost to 1990. And there's a lot that happens during that period. So a lot of what's happening is some disputes over whether the PLO or the Palestinian leadership should be allowed to stay and engage in terrorism from Lebanese territory. And you had different groups arguing that no, it shouldn't. Especially Christian groups like Maronite Christians were definitely against the idea that the PLO should be allowed to operate in southern Lebanon in this way. You also had foreign powers that kind of intervened in order to try to prevent some of this conflict from really getting out of hand. Yeah. Countries like the United States, Syria, Israel at some point invades, in 1982. So there's all kinds of different things happening during this time period. And a lot of fighting that's going to happen. Unfortunately, what winds up happening in the process is the government kind of gets sidelined to a little bit. It collapses to a certain degree. A lot of smaller militias are really gaining a lot of influence and power at the time and competing for some control over the government, but also the physical power to decide who gets to fight and stay in what portion of the territory, that sort of thing. Along the same lines, or around the same time, I should say, in 1979, the Islamic Revolution in Iran happens. And this is really important, and it can't be overlooked, because this idea, this almost universal experience that Shia Muslims share that gives them this pre-inclination towards revolutionary politics, it's happening not just in Lebanon, but also in places like Iran. And so in Iran, there's this massive Islamic revolution. And what winds up happening is they do establish a new Islamic regime in Iran as a result of the revolution. And for the first time, some Shia Muslims around the region look at this and realize, hey, wait a minute, it's actually possible to change something. Maybe it doesn't have to always be this way. Maybe we can take control of the situation, liberate ourselves, all of this. And so all of a sudden, the Islamic regime in Iran has this massive amount of social capital to work with, some public support. and influence that the Shia Muslims in Iran didn't previously have. As a result of the revolution, they formed the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which basically was designed to protect the revolution and try to spread it around the region as proof that it was real and it could actually work. And they basically went to Lebanon. They started to find different Shia militia groups that were fighting, and they found people that they could sponsor, that they could support, and they could organize into a new militia. And eventually, the collective that they built became Hezbollah.
Interesting. So you talked a little bit about the IRGC, and obviously this does pertain to Iran. How exactly does Lebanon factor into this equation? Why did Iran send the IRGC to Lebanon?
So, two answers. One, I think you're definitely going to want to. I know we've already referenced another video to watch, but another video that's really good to watch would be the video on Iran. I think I'd definitely recommend that to the audience because there's going to be more context in there about the revolution, of course.
For sure.
But just a really quick summary: the revolution was built on an ideology and a specific brand of Shia Islam, and it was also built on the idea that the revolution could be proven to be credible, true, and effective if it could be spread. If it could not be spread, then the ideas that it was built upon, which should be transferable or translatable to Shia Muslims elsewhere, are not true, and then the revolution could collapse. So Iran was really intervening in Lebanon, or the regime, I should say, was intervening in Lebanon for its own self-interest.
Interesting.
Because it was actually the best way to protect the revolution at home was to try to export the revolution abroad.
Interesting. So we have talked a little bit about ideologies in this episode specifically and past episodes. Can you tell us a little bit about what Hezbollah believes?
Yeah, so it's an inherently Islamist organization. The term Hezbollah actually means party of God, or its translation, rather. So there's certainly a very religious and Islamist overtone to the organization. It is very, of course, Shia in nature. It also shares a bit of Iran's specific ideology. I mentioned this specific brand of Shia Islam that Iran ascribes to, which basically holds that government is organized best when it includes the oversight of religious scholars or clerics, or there is some sort of theocratic element overseen by these religious scholars or clerics. So it's a bit of a paradox in the sense that this is what Hezbollah believes is best, that it is loyal to and subscribes to the same ideology that Iran does in this respect, that government needs to operate with the bit of theocracy infused into it. But at the same time, it's pretty pragmatic. It would argue that it doesn't want to or doesn't believe that it can impose a certain brand of Islam on the rest of Lebanese citizens. Basically, what it argues is that it needs to support democracy and freedom of choice regarding religious orientation and nature of the makeup of the government. And as long as people have a choice, they will choose Hezbollah's brand of Islam, essentially.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a bit of a paradox, but it is a large degree of confidence they have in their ideology that eventually people are going to agree with us and they'll pick our side anyways. So we might as well give them the choice because they're going to come around eventually. Yeah. That's basically the idea. It does argue as well that it is very important to protect the resistance. This is not dissimilar to Hamas, that a key part of the identity of the organization is resistance, especially resistance against Israel. It has, initially it tried to stay out of Lebanese politics, and then it kind of started to get more involved for various reasons, which we don't necessarily have time to go into. But even today, it is a little bit involved in Lebanese politics for sure. In large part, though, many scholars believe, I should say, that part of the reason why Hezbollah got involved in Lebanese politics in the first place was so that it could have some say over whether or not it would be allowed to maintain a resistance against Israel. Because if the Lebanese government wanted to disarm Hezbollah, for example, Hezbollah needs people in the government to prevent that from happening. Because, again, the resistance is very, very important. Yeah. So you've got this interesting concoction of we have to resist Israel. We need to have a semi-theocratic government, but we can't impose it on people.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to find a way to make people want a theocratic
Yeah.
system of government, and then they'll choose it for themselves.
Mm.
It's an interesting combination for sure.
Yeah. So you've talked about what Hezbollah believes. Can you tell us a little bit about how they operate?
Yeah, it's interesting because they technically, as an organization, if you read some of their founding documents, owe some degree of allegiance to the supreme leader in Iran, which is the Ayatollah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an interesting dilemma that has puzzled people for a very long time. To what degree do they answer to themselves versus the Ayatollah? And it's confusing for sure, but it does give you a little bit of a sense for the role that ideology continues to play in the way that the organization chooses to operate.
Yeah.
It is ideologically oriented, not just to Lebanese politics, but also to this wider Shia revolution in many ways. Now, in terms of how it chooses to run itself, it is run by a Shura council, which is a term that you might be familiar with if you've watched a video on Hamas. They have one too. It's kind of like this consensus council in which you try to reach some agreements among the leaders of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
This is divided into various sub-councils. So you have various groups focusing, or different councils focusing on different portions of the organization's operations, whether that's politics, or there's a judiciary, there's a social services wing, there's a propaganda wing, there's also a resistance / military / terror wing known as the Jihad Council. This is very interesting. So the individual who was assassinated in Beirut by the Israelis, whose name was Fuad Shukr, he was actually the head of the Jihad Council. So this was really a major deal. End of July, early August of 2024.
Mm-hmm.
This is basically the equivalent of the chief of staff of the Hezbollah military is assassinated, and he's considered to be one of the top leaders within the organization because he leads this sub council. It comprises a part of the organization's overall Shura Council, which supports the work of the Secretary General Nasrallah. Functionally speaking, I should say, in many of the areas that it controls, one of the reasons why Lebanon is considered a failed state is because Hezbollah basically is the de facto government.
Mm-hmm.
If you listen to a lot of the councils I just named, I mean, they're doing a lot.
Yeah.
Social services, politics, they offer a court system. I mean, it's
Yeah.
pretty thorough the way that they've tried to create some infrastructure to support society in the way that they view best.
Yeah. It's definitely interesting to see how complex Hezbollah is and the way that it operates, especially in Lebanon. It's definitely very fascinating to learn about. So I'm curious, is Hezbollah confined only to Lebanon? I know we've talked a lot about Lebanon playing a factor in Hezbollah,
Sure.
or is Hezbollah more widespread than just Lebanon?
Definitely more widespread. And this gets, again, in part to some of the history of Lebanon that's important before we can accurately understand Hezbollah's history.
Mm-hmm.
But a key aspect of the Shia experience in Lebanon, because of the feeling like there was a lack of opportunity, that they were neglected by the government, that they were being taken advantage of even by the elites of the Shia community, many Shia Muslims over the last century, let's say, left Lebanon and went elsewhere around the world looking for better opportunities for work or whatever it may be. And they wound up all over the world, in Europe, in Latin America, in Africa, several different continents that they wound up on as a result of this. And there were Shia diaspora communities, or Lebanese Shia communities around different parts of the world. Hezbollah tapped into that and has built its own network of different operations in different parts of the world and collaborating with different governments that are hostile to the United States. Hezbollah is not just committed to resisting Israel, but also is very committed to resisting the United States and has a strange sort of bedfellow arrangement with different countries like Venezuela, for example. It has drug running operations with networks around Latin America and Africa.
Wow.
I mean, it's pretty wild. It's very extensive.
Yeah.
And it has also a this foreign or / external security apparatus that conducts terror operations around the world too, much less frequently than the type of terror operations that it conducts against Israel. But its operations and the evil that it does are not confined to Lebanon.
Wow. So we've talked a lot about Lebanon, about Hezbollah's influence in other countries. Now the series is called Israel Explained. So I have to ask, what is Hezbollah's relationship with Israel today?
Yeah, it's interesting for sure. So it has fought multiple wars against Israel, big and small. It has found itself constrained in part by domestic politics, but also motivated by its ideology. So its ideology is very anti-Israel, very committed to resisting Israel, conducting terror operations, but also constrained in the sense that Hezbollah got involved in some wars over the last 10, 15 years, places like Syria during the Syrian civil war, places like Yemen. And many Lebanese citizens are kind of tired, honestly, of Hezbollah getting involved in these different countries, different foreign conflicts. So there's a sense in which Hezbollah has to be careful not to lose too much of its popularity by overplaying its hand in its conflict with Israel, but also has to do enough to convince its most diehard supporters that it's still resisting Israel. It is by far, despite these political realities which kind of force it to resolve some tension, it is by far the most dangerous organization or dangerous threat on Israel's borders compared to its neighbors and the threats that they pose, especially in terms of the number of weapons. So, Hamas had maybe 40,000 fighters. It had, of course, thousands of rockets. It didn't have missiles. It didn't have sophisticated drones. It had some, but not sophisticated drones. Hezbollah has an arsenal of anywhere from 100,000 to 200,000 rockets. It can fire an estimated thousands of rockets in a single day. It has sophisticated missile programs. It has sophisticated drone programs, both attack and suicide drones. It has anti-tank missiles. It has precision-guided munitions. They can hit an exact target, unlike Hamas, which kind of just fires and hopes that it hits something. It has underground fortifications. It has a special forces unit. I mean, it's a formidable threat. It is a very well-organized and very well-armed organization.
Yeah.
So Israel does have to be very wary of this, because if Hezbollah wanted to, it could launch an all-out war against Israel that would be extraordinarily dangerous. And frankly, a lot of people would be killed on both sides. Now, I think there is some debate that we need to be aware of, though, in terms of if that's actually what Hezbollah wants.
Yeah.
And this is where that tension that they're dealing with, the tension between the ideology and the politics becomes important, because it helps explain why, for the most part, at least up until this point, or when we're recording this episode, you typically see temporary escalations, not long-term, full-scale escalations. And Hezbollah's strategy is probably better defined as a slow war of attrition. Again, at the time we're recording this episode, Hezbollah has been fighting for many months and has forced Israel to evacuate its citizens from the border between Israel and Lebanon. It has effectively held the country on edge for up to almost a month at a time before various attacks, threatening attacks, but holding off and engaging in some psychological warfare. And this seems to honestly be Hezbollah's strategy. Why go for an all-out war if a bunch of Lebanese people are going to get killed and they're going to hate us, Hezbollah, for it, when we can force Israel to forfeit territory and to evacuate its civilians instead and engage in psychological warfare. And eventually, the belief is that Israel can only take it so long.
Yeah.
That eventually one of two things will happen. Either an all-out war will happen, which Hezbollah will win with the help of other groups like Iran, or the Jews will give up because they're weak and they'll just leave. That's essentially their strategy and their approach to fighting Israel is we can wait as long as it takes.
Yeah. It's very, very intense things to be thinking about between Israel and Hezbollah right now. So we've talked a lot about the relationship there. As we're closing out our episode today, I'm curious what the relationship is like between Hezbollah and other countries in the Middle East. So can you tell us a little bit about what the relationship is like between Hezbollah and Iran and Hezbollah and Syria?
Sure. Well, I'll start with Syria because I think I've already mentioned this. So just a brief reminder that the relationship with Syria is on again, off again.
Mm-hmm.
Syria in some ways has been helpful to Hezbollah, and especially when it was getting started, there was some support provided. It is very strategically important to Hezbollah because it helps form the land bridge that connects Hezbollah to Iran. A lot of the weapons that Hezbollah gets from Iran, it gets via land routes through Syria, so it's very important in that respect. It's also a little bit of a liability. Like I just said a few minutes ago, politically speaking, Hezbollah's presence in Syria, the amount of fighting that they've done there, is somewhat of a liability in terms of their popular support amongst Lebanese today.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to Iran, there's probably less question of whether they should be close to Iran. It's core to the organization's ideological tenets, the roots of the organization. It is effectively a client of the Islamic regime, which is loyal to the regime but also dependent on the regime for funding, training, weapons, ideological leadership. It's a key part of the Iranian regime's strategy to fight Israel, but also to deter the U.S. and its influence in the region. It's key to Iran's strategy really for the entire region in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a pretty close relationship there that doesn't seem to be as under a suspicion, maybe, because would be a word that you could use, as the relationship is with Syria. They don't have to justify as much the relationship with Iran as they do the relationship with Syria. It is, of course, as I've already mentioned, still constrained by Lebanese politics, though. So it can, and it often does, take some directives from Iran when Iran says, okay, now is the time to fight. At the same time, it also has some conversations. And it's been pretty clear over the last several months of fighting that Hezbollah has been having a lot of conversations with Iran about, okay, you want us to do this, here's what we can do. You want us to do it, then what if we do it this time instead? There's some back and forth. It's obvious that Hezbollah does answer to Iran, but also that Hezbollah answers to the Lebanese public as well, who they have to try to protect, or they'll be kicked out of Lebanon. So there's a bit of a back and forth there, some negotiation sometimes that happens between the two.
Well, Josiah, thank you so much for unpacking this very complex relationship between Hezbollah and so many other countries in the Middle East. We really appreciate it. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us again and for taking time to listen to this episode. If you have any more questions about anything that we discussed in today's episode, be sure to leave a comment below and we would love to help answer your question. If you're looking for more resources related to topics that we've discussed today, check out the description for a link to some more resources that can help you out. And be sure to follow us on Instagram for more content related to Israel and the Middle East. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.